The bitter January wind cut through downtown Millbrook like a blade, carrying with it the promise of another harsh night ahead. Marcus Thompson pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders as he shuffled down Main Street, his worn boots leaving wet prints on the salted sidewalk. The small Michigan town was bundled up against the cold, windows glowing amber with warmth that seemed impossibly distant from where Marcus stood. He'd been living on these streets for 8 months now, ever since the factory closure had taken his job and the medical bills from his daughter's cancer treatment had taken everything else. The public library was his sanctuary during the day, a place where he could sit among the stacks and pretend he belonged somewhere. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, had never asked him to leave, though she'd catch his eye sometimes with a look that held more kindness than pity. Today, like most days, Marcus had spent the morning reading newspapers from other cities, imagining what life might be like if he could just find the bus fare to start over somewhere new. The afternoon had been spent at the community center, where they served a hot lunch to anyone who needed one, no questions asked. Volunteers ladled out portions of soup and handed out day-old bread with the kind of determined cheerfulness that made Marcus both grateful and somehow more aware of how far he'd fallen. As evening approached, Marcus made his way toward the underpass, where he'd fashioned a makeshift shelter from cardboard and plastic tarps. It wasn't much, but it blocked the worst of the wind, and he'd learned which spots stayed driest when the snow melted. The route took him past Clearwater Lake, a small body of water that served as the town's unofficial gathering place during warmer months. In summer, families would picnic on its shores while children splashed in the shallows. Now, in the depths of winter, it lay frozen solid, covered by a thick sheet of ice that reflected the grey sky like a mirror. The lake was usually deserted this time of year, which was why Marcus paused when he heard the sound. At first, he thought it might be kids playing, but as he got closer, the noise resolved into something else entirely. High-pitched and desperate, it was unmistakably the sound of an animal in distress. Marcus quickened his pace, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air as he approached the lake's edge. What he saw made his blood run cold, and not just from the temperature. About 30 feet from shore, a golden retriever was struggling in a hole in the ice, its head barely above the dark water. The dog must have ventured onto what looked like solid ice, only to break through into the freezing lake below. Now it paddled frantically, trying to pull itself up onto the ice shelf, but each attempt only seemed to break away more of the fragile edge. Its golden fur was already darkening with ice water, and Marcus could see exhaustion setting in as the dog's movements became more labored. Without thinking, Marcus began stripping off his coat. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was insane, that he barely had enough body heat to keep himself alive on a night like this, let alone after a plunge into freezing water. But as he watched the dog's desperate struggle, something deeper than rationality took over. He thought of Princess, the beagle he'd had to give up when he lost his apartment, how she'd looked at him with those trusting brown eyes as he'd handed her leash to the animal shelter volunteer. He thought of all the times he'd felt like he was drowning, with no one around to throw him a lifeline. The ice near the shore was thicker, but Marcus could hear it groaning under his weight as he began to crawl forward on his belly, distributing his weight as evenly as possible. He'd grown up in Michigan and knew enough about ice rescue to understand that standing up would be a death sentence. Instead, he moved like a soldier under fire, his elbows and knees burning against the frozen surface as he inched toward the struggling animal. 20 feet out, the ice began to show stress fractures, thin lines spiderwebbing beneath him. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept moving. The dog had spotted him now and was swimming toward him, its movements becoming more frantic. "Easy, boy," Marcus called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "Easy now. I'm coming." At 15 feet from the dog, Marcus felt the ice give way beneath him with a crack that sounded like gunfire. The shock of the water was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It felt like every nerve in his body had been plugged into an electrical socket. His muscles seized, and for a moment, panic overwhelmed him as the cold water closed over his head. But somehow years of hard living had taught him how to function through pain, and he forced himself to the surface, gasping and sputtering. The dog was only a few feet away now, its eyes wide with terror but also something that looked like hope. Marcus reached out, his numb fingers finally making contact with wet fur. The retriever was heavier than he'd expected, waterlogged and panicking, but Marcus managed to get an arm around the animal's chest. "I got you," he whispered, his lips already turning blue. "I got you, buddy." Getting back to shore proved to be the hardest thing Marcus had ever done. The ice kept breaking under their combined weight, forcing him to swim from one edge to another, always moving toward land that seemed impossibly far away. His soaked clothing felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and the cold was making his thoughts sluggish. More than once he considered letting go, but each time he looked at the dog's face, something kept him fighting. By the time they reached water shallow enough for Marcus to touch bottom, he could barely feel his extremities. The dog, though exhausted, seemed to understand that safety was within reach, and began to paddle with renewed energy. Together, they crawled out onto the muddy shore, both of them shaking violently from cold and shock. Marcus had just enough presence of mind to grab his coat and wrap it around the dog before his own body began to shut down. The wet clothes were already beginning to freeze on his skin, and he knew he had minutes, not hours, to find shelter and warmth. But as he looked at the golden retriever, now alert and looking up at him with what he could swear was gratitude, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of having done something that mattered. It was then that he heard the voices. A woman's voice, high and worried, calling out a name. "Bailey! Bailey, where are you?" The voice was getting closer, accompanied by the sound of running footsteps on the path that circled the lake. "Over here," Marcus called out, his voice hoarse and weak but carrying enough to be heard. Within moments, a woman appeared at the top of the small hill that led down to the shore. She was middle-aged, wearing an expensive-looking winter coat and boots that suggested she wasn't from the rougher parts of town. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the relief flood her face when she spotted the dog. "Oh my God, Bailey!" she cried, rushing down the slope with surprising agility. The dog's tail began to wag, despite its obvious exhaustion, and it tried to stand on shaking legs. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The gate must have blown open in the wind. It was only when she reached them that the woman seemed to fully register Marcus's condition. Her eyes widened as she took in his soaked clothes, his blue-tinged skin, and the way he was shivering uncontrollably. "What happened?" she asked, but even as the words left her mouth, understanding dawned on her face. The wet dog, the man's condition, the hole in the ice visible not far from shore, the story was written in the evidence around them. "He fell through," Marcus managed to say through chattering teeth. "Couldn't just leave him there." The woman stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression. It wasn't pity exactly, but something deeper and more complex. "You saved him," she said quietly. "You could have died." Marcus tried to shrug, but his body was shaking too hard for the gesture to carry much meaning. "Anybody would have done it," he said, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. How many people would have stopped? How many would have risked their lives for a stranger's pet? "What's your name?" the woman asked, already pulling out her phone. "Marcus," he replied, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance, about the smell of unwashed clothes and the stubble on his face. "Marcus Thompson." "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, her fingers flying over her phone screen. "I'm calling 911. You need to get to a hospital right now." She paused in her dialing to look at him directly. "My family is going to want to thank you properly for this, Marcus. Bailey isn't just a pet to us. He's family." As they waited for the paramedics, Sarah wrapped her own coat around Marcus's shoulders, despite his protests. She told him about Bailey, how her 8-year-old daughter Emma had picked him out at the shelter 3 years ago, how he'd been Emma's constant companion through her parents' difficult divorce. The dog had somehow become the thread that held their fractured family together, giving Emma something stable to love while her world changed around her. "Emma's at her dad's place this weekend," Sarah explained, her hand never leaving Bailey's wet fur. "She would have been devastated if something had happened to him. You have no idea what you've done for us tonight." The ambulance arrived along with a police car, their flashing lights painting the winter landscape in reds and blues. The paramedics were efficient and kind, wrapping Marcus in heated blankets and checking his vital signs while asking gentle questions about what had happened. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, told him he was lucky to be conscious, that hypothermia could have easily killed him in water that cold. As they loaded Marcus into the ambulance, Sarah appeared at the door. "I'll follow you to the hospital," she said. "And Marcus, thank you. That word doesn't seem like enough, but thank you." At Millbrook General Hospital, Marcus found himself in a strange new world of warm blankets and hot soup, of nurses who called him Sir, and doctors who treated him with the same respect they'd give any other patient. His core temperature had dropped dangerously low, but the medical staff assured him that he'd suffered no permanent damage. "You were incredibly lucky," Dr. Patterson told him as she reviewed his chart. Most people don't walk away from something like this. Sarah had indeed followed the ambulance, bringing Bailey to the animal emergency clinic before coming to check on Marcus. She appeared in his room the next morning with flowers and a basket of homemade cookies, looking somewhat nervous but determined. "The vet says Bailey is going to be fine," she reported. "A little traumatized, maybe, but physically he's okay." She sat down in the visitor's chair and regarded Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," she said, "about what you did, and I realized I don't know anything about you, about your life." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. Here it comes, he thought. The questions about why he was homeless, the assumptions about addiction or mental illness or moral failing. He'd heard it all before, seen the way people's expressions changed when they learned his circumstances. But Sarah surprised him. "I work in social services," she said simply, "for the county. I've seen how people end up on the streets, and I know it's usually not their fault. What I want to know is what we can do to help you get back on your feet." Over the next hour, Marcus found himself telling his story to someone who listened without judgment. He talked about his daughter Melissa, how her leukemia diagnosis had appeared out of nowhere when she was 16, how the insurance had covered some treatments but not others, and how he'd taken out loans and second mortgages to pay for experimental therapies that might save her life, how she'd fought for 2 years before losing the battle, leaving him not only heartbroken, but financially destroyed. "The medical bills were just the beginning," Marcus explained, staring at his hands. "After Melissa died, I couldn't function, couldn't work. I used up all my savings, then my retirement. Lost the house, then the apartment. By the time I pulled myself together enough to look for work again, the factory had closed and there weren't any jobs for a 53-year-old assembly line worker with a 6-month gap in his employment history." Sarah listened to all of it, nodding occasionally and asking clarifying questions that showed she understood the bureaucratic nightmares that could trap people in poverty. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think I might be able to help you navigate some of the assistance programs, and I know Bailey's vet, Dr. Martinez. She's always looking for reliable help at the clinic. It's not much to start with, but it's something." That afternoon, Marcus was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health and Sarah's business card. She'd offered to drive him wherever he needed to go, but Marcus insisted he could manage the walk back to his shelter under the bridge. "At least let me give you some proper winter clothes," Sarah had said, returning later with bags from the local outdoor gear shop. "Consider it payment for saving Bailey's life." The news of the rescue had apparently spread while Marcus was in the hospital. When he returned to his usual spots around town, he found that people were looking at him differently. Mrs. Henderson at the library greeted him by name and asked how he was feeling. The volunteers at the community center had heard the story and treated him like a returning hero rather than just another person in need of a meal. But it was the children who affected him most. Kids who had previously looked through him as if he were invisible now pointed him out to their parents with excitement. "That's the man who saved the dog," he heard a little boy whisper loudly to his mother as they passed on the sidewalk. The mother, instead of hurrying her child along, stopped and thanked Marcus personally. Dr. Martinez at the veterinary clinic proved to be as warm and practical as Sarah had promised. She was a small woman in her 40s with graying hair and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years healing animals. "Sarah tells me you're good with dogs," she said, when Marcus showed up for an impromptu interview, "and that you're looking for work." The job wasn't glamorous, cleaning kennels, feeding animals, helping with basic care, but it came with a small salary and, more importantly, a sense of purpose. Marcus found that he had a natural way with the animals, especially the scared or traumatized ones. "You have a gift," Dr. Martinez told him after his first week. "These animals trust you in a way they don't trust everyone." Sarah had been true to her word about helping him navigate the social services system. She'd connected him with programs he didn't even know existed, helping him apply for temporary housing assistance and job training programs. But more than that, she'd become something Marcus hadn't expected to find again, a friend. 3 weeks after the rescue, Sarah invited Marcus to dinner at her house. It was the first time he'd been inside a real home since losing his apartment, and he felt awkward and out of place, despite Sarah's efforts to make him comfortable. But then Emma came home from her father's house and everything changed. Emma Chen was 8 years old with her mother's kind eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. Bailey, fully recovered from his ordeal, bounded toward her the moment she walked through the door, his tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled. Bailey, Emma cried, dropping her backpack and wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. I missed you so much. It was then that Sarah called Marcus over. Emma, she said gently, there's someone I want you to meet. This is Marcus. He's the man who saved Bailey's life. Emma looked up at Marcus with eyes that held no judgment, no awareness of social boundaries or class distinctions. She saw only the man who had rescued her beloved dog. Thank you, she said simply, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and hugging Marcus around the waist. Thank you for saving Bailey. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but it broke something open in Marcus's chest that he'd kept locked away since Melissa's death. For the first time in months, he felt tears on his face, and they weren't tears of despair, but of something else entirely. Connection, hope, the feeling that he mattered to someone in the world. Dinner was a revelation. Emma chatted about school and her friends, and her latest art project, including Marcus in the conversation as naturally as if he'd been a family friend for years. Sarah had made pot roast with vegetables, the kind of home-cooked meal Marcus had almost forgotten existed. As they ate, Emma regaled them with stories about Bailey's personality quirks and habits, painting a picture of a dog who was clearly the center of her universe. He sleeps on my bed every night, Emma explained to Marcus, even though Mom says he's not supposed to, and he knows when I'm sad. Whenever I cry, he comes and puts his head on my lap. Marcus found himself telling Emma about Princess, the beagle he'd had to give up, and about Melissa's childhood dog, a mutt named Scrappy, who had been her constant companion until his death when she was 12. Emma listened with the intense focus that children reserve for stories about animals, asking questions and offering her own observations about pet behavior. After dinner, Emma insisted on showing Marcus her room, where she had a wall covered with photos of Bailey in various poses and situations. This is my favorite, she said, pointing to a picture of Bailey wearing a birthday hat, his tongue lolling out in a doggy grin. It was his adoption day party. Mum says every dog deserves a celebration when they find their forever home. As Marcus prepared to leave that evening, Sarah pulled him aside. I hope you don't mind, she said, but I've told a few people about what you did. The story's been making the rounds on social media, and there are people who want to help. Marcus felt a familiar discomfort at the idea of being the object of charity, but Sarah seemed to sense his reaction. Not charity, she clarified. Recognition. What you did was heroic, Marcus. People want to acknowledge that. She was right about the story spreading. Over the following days, Marcus found himself approached by strangers who had heard about the rescue. A local restaurant owner offered him free meals. A clothing store owner insisted on giving him a warm winter coat. The owner of a small apartment building mentioned that he might have a unit available soon, and that he was looking for a reliable tenant who could help with maintenance in exchange for reduced rent. But it was the letter that arrived at Dr. Martinez's clinic, addressed simply to the man who saved Bailey, that affected Marcus most deeply. Inside was a hand-drawn picture of a golden retriever and a man standing by a lake, along with a note written in crayon. Thank you for saving Bailey. You are my hero. Love, Emma. Dr. Martinez found Marcus sitting in the clinic's break room, staring at the drawing with tears in his eyes. That little girl, she said gently, she's been through a lot with her parents' divorce. That dog has been her anchor through all of it. You didn't just save an animal, Marcus. You saved a little girl's sense of security in the world. 2 months after the rescue, Marcus received news that changed everything. Sarah had helped him apply for a job with the county's Animal Control Division, a position that would combine his growing expertise with animals and his desire to help others. The pay was modest but steady, and it came with benefits and the possibility of advancement. They were impressed with your references, Sarah told him when she called with the news. Dr. Martinez gave you a glowing recommendation, and several of the families whose pets you've helped at the clinic wrote letters of support. The apartment had come through as well. Mr. Kowalski, the building owner, had offered Marcus a 1-bedroom unit on the ground floor in exchange for 20 hours a week of maintenance work. It wasn't much, but it had a real bed, a small kitchen, and most importantly, it was his. The day Marcus moved into his apartment, Sarah and Emma showed up with a housewarming gift, a small potted plant and a framed copy of Emma's drawing of the rescue. Every home needs something growing in it, Sarah explained as she placed the plant on Marcus's windowsill, and every hero needs a reminder of why they matter. Emma had been quieter than usual, but as they prepared to leave, she tugged on Marcus's sleeve. Can I ask you something? She said, looking up at him with serious eyes. "So of course," Marcus replied, kneeling down to her level. "Were you scared?" she asked. "When you went into the lake to save Bailey?" Marcus considered the question carefully. He could have given her a simple answer, told her he hadn't thought about it, but something in her expression suggested she needed the truth. "Yes," he said finally. "I was very scared. The water was cold, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to save both of us." "But you did it anyway," Emma said. "It wasn't a question. I did it anyway," Marcus confirmed. Emma nodded solemnly, then surprised him by hugging him again. "I'm glad you were brave," she whispered. "I'm glad you didn't let the scared feeling stop you." As summer arrived in Millbrook, Marcus settled into his new life with a sense of wonder that never quite faded. His work with animal control was challenging but rewarding, and he'd discovered he had a talent for handling difficult rescue situations. His apartment had slowly filled with the basic necessities of life, each piece of furniture or kitchen equipment representing another step away from the streets. But it was the relationships that had formed in the wake of that frozen January night that truly changed everything. Sarah had become not just a friend, but a kind of family, someone who checked on him regularly and included him in holiday celebrations and casual dinners. Emma had appointed herself his honorary granddaughter, sharing school projects and asking for help with homework problems that involved animals, and Bailey, now fully recovered from his traumatic experience, had apparently decided that Marcus was part of his pack. Whenever Marcus visited Sarah's house, the golden retriever would greet him with the same enthusiasm reserved for family members, bringing him toys and settling down beside his chair as if to say, "I remember what you did for me." One evening in late June, as Marcus sat on a bench in the park near the lake where it all began, Sarah joined him with 2 cups of coffee from the nearby cafe. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching children play on the beach while parents kept careful watch from nearby. "Do you ever think about that night?" Sarah asked eventually. Marcus nodded, his eyes on the water that now sparkled with summer sunshine instead of reflecting winter's grey sky. "Every day," he said. "Not because it was traumatic, but because it changed everything." "You changed everything," Sarah corrected gently. "Your choice to act, to risk your life for something that mattered. That's what changed everything." As they talked, a young family walked by with a golden retriever puppy, and Marcus found himself smiling at the sight. The dog's antics reminded him of Bailey as a younger animal, all boundless energy and uncontainable joy. The family paused to let their children pet the puppy, and Marcus overheard the father telling someone on his phone, "We just got him from the animal rescue downtown. The guy who works there, Marcus, he helped us find the perfect match for our kids." Sarah caught Marcus's eye and grinned. "You're becoming quite the local celebrity," she teased. "I just like matching people with the right animals," Marcus replied, but he couldn't hide his own smile. There's something magical about seeing a person and a pet find each other. As autumn returned to Michigan, Marcus realized he'd been housed for nearly a year. The anniversary of the rescue was approaching, and Emma had announced plans for what she called Bailey Day, a celebration of the dog's second chance at life and the man who had given it to him. She'd convinced her school to let her do a presentation about animal rescue, with Marcus as a guest speaker. Standing in front of 30 second graders, Marcus felt more nervous than he had facing the frozen lake. But as he began to tell the story, focusing on the importance of helping others and never giving up hope, he saw the children's faces light up with interest and inspiration. Their questions ranged from practical, "Wasn't the water really cold?" to philosophical, "How did you know Bailey wanted you to save him?" And Marcus found himself enjoying the discussion more than he'd expected. After his presentation, a little boy named Tyler approached him. "Mr. Marcus," he said, "my mum says some people don't have homes. Is that true?" Marcus looked at the child's teacher, who nodded encouragingly. "It is true," Marcus said carefully. "Sometimes people lose their homes for different reasons. Sometimes they get sick and can't work, or their jobs go away, or they have problems they can't solve by themselves." Tyler considered this seriously. "But you have a home now, right?" "I do," Marcus confirmed. "I have a home because people helped me when I needed help, just like I helped Bailey when he needed help." The boy nodded, as if this made perfect sense to him. "My mom says helping people is the most important thing you can do." "Your mom is very smart," Marcus told him. That evening, Emma's official Bailey Day celebration took place at Sarah's house, with several neighbors and friends joining in. Dr. Martinez brought homemade dog treats shaped like bones, and Mr. Kowalski, Marcus's landlord, surprised everyone by showing up with a cake decorated with a fondant golden retriever. Even Mrs. Henderson from the library attended, bringing with her a photo album she'd created, documenting Marcus's transformation from the quiet man who used to spend his days in the stacks to the animal control officer who was becoming a pillar of the community. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Emma presented Marcus with her latest artwork, a painting of him and Bailey, but this time they were standing on solid ground beside the lake, both of them safe and surrounded by friends and family. At the bottom, in Emma's careful handwriting, she'd written, "Heroes don't just save the day, they make every day better." Bailey, now 4 years old and showing no lasting effects from his ordeal, spent the evening moving from person to person, collecting pets and treats with the easy confidence of a dog who knows he's loved. When the party was over and only Marcus, Sarah and Emma remained, Bailey settled down with his head on Marcus's feet, a gesture that had become his way of saying thank you. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said as she loaded dishes into the dishwasher, "about what you said that first night at the hospital when you told the paramedic that anyone would have done what you did." Marcus looked up from where he was helping Emma organize her art supplies. "What about it?" "I don't think that's true," Sarah said. "I think you did something extraordinary, something that most people wouldn't have done, and I think you need to recognize that about yourself." Emma, who had been quietly working on another drawing, looked up suddenly. "Mom's right," she said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess. "Not everyone is brave enough to jump into freezing water, but you did it because you saw someone who needed help, and you couldn't just walk away." As Marcus tucked Emma in that night, a privilege he'd been granted as his honorary grandfather status became more established, she asked him one more question. "Do you think Bailey remembers what happened?" Marcus looked at the golden retriever, who had followed them upstairs and was now settling down beside Emma's bed for the night. "I think he remembers that someone helped him when he was scared," Marcus said, "and I think that made him feel safe enough to trust people again." "Like how people helping you made you feel safe enough to trust again?" Emma asked, with the perceptiveness that sometimes surprised adults. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Yes," he said quietly, "exactly like that." A year and a half after the rescue, Marcus stood before the Millbrook City Council to receive a commendation for community service. His work with animal control had expanded to include educational programs at local schools, and he'd helped establish a partnership between the county and local businesses to provide job training for people experiencing homelessness. The ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by many of the people who had become important to him over the past months. Sarah sat in the front row with Emma, who was now 10 and had recently been accepted into a program for young artists. Bailey, of course, was not allowed in the council chambers, but Marcus knew the dog was waiting at home, probably napping in the sunny spot by the living room window that had become his favorite place. As the mayor presented him with the award, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with a single act of compassion, a moment when instinct had overridden self-preservation and he'd chosen to help a creature in need. But that moment had been just the beginning of a transformation that was still ongoing. The recognition was nice, but what mattered more to Marcus was the life he'd built in the wake of that frozen night. He had meaningful work, a place to call home, and relationships that gave his days purpose and joy. He'd rediscovered something he thought he'd lost forever when Melissa died, the sense that his life had value, that his actions could make a difference in the world. After the ceremony, as friends and colleagues gathered for cake and coffee in the council chambers, Marcus found himself in conversation with a young reporter from the local newspaper. She was writing a follow-up story about his work with animal control and wanted to know what advice he'd give to others facing difficult circumstances. Marcus thought about the question carefully. "I guess I'd say that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything," he said finally. "Not just for the person or animal you're helping, but for yourself. When you're at your lowest point, when you feel like you don't matter, sometimes the way back begins with helping someone else." The reporter nodded and scribbled notes, but Marcus wasn't sure he'd captured what he really meant. How do you explain that saving a dog's life had somehow saved his own? How do you describe the way a child's hug can rebuild a person's faith in humanity? How do you put into words the feeling of being part of a community again after months of invisibility? As the evening wound down, Marcus walked home through the quiet streets of downtown Millbrook. The town looked different to him now than it had during those dark months when he'd wandered these same sidewalks as an outsider. Now he knew the shop owners, and they knew him. Children waved when they saw him, and parents smiled and asked about his work. He belonged here in a way he'd never expected to belong anywhere again. At his apartment, Marcus found a card that had been slipped under his door. Inside was a photo of Bailey playing in Sarah's backyard, along with a note from Emma. Bailey says thank you for giving him so many happy days. I say thank you for showing me what real heroes look like. Love, your honorary granddaughter, Emma. As Marcus prepared for bed, he looked out his window toward the lake where it all began. In the moonlight, the water was calm and silver, giving no hint of the drama that had played out there on that frozen January night. But Marcus carried the memory with him always, not as a burden but as a reminder of what was possible when people chose compassion over self-interest, action over inaction. The next morning would bring new challenges at work, new animals to help, new people to serve. There would be difficult days ahead, setbacks and disappointments that were part of any life, but Marcus faced the future with something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope. And every time he doubted his worth or wondered if his efforts mattered, he had only to remember a little girl's gratitude, a golden retriever's trust, and a community's willingness to embrace someone they'd once overlooked. Sometimes, Marcus had learned, being a hero wasn't about grand gestures or extraordinary abilities. Sometimes it was simply about refusing to walk past someone in need, even when, especially when, you were struggling yourself.